Hello everyone, my name is Caleb Knox. I want to thank you all for taking the time to come out here today. What I want to do for us is raise a couple key questions that I believe that our culture is struggling with on a more inarticulate level as we speak. I think when you take part in any creative enterprise, specifically in the intellectual domain, what's more important is the questions that you're raising more than the questions you're answering, because I'm an 18-year-old boy, what do I know? But at the end of the day, what we're bringing up today, we're going to wrestle with and we're going to struggle with and we're going to talk about over the course of 3 days. So what I've dubbed these lectures is the biblical foundations of free speech. What I want to do is explore how biblical thought and the words of Jesus have transpired to come into our modern notion of free speech. Now, I want to be upfront with everyone listening. This isn't going to be an obvious defense of free speech. If you want that, you can go read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, right? That's where we obviously see saying free speech is good because of this, this, and this. We're going to take it a level deeper. What I want to ask today are, what are the assumptions that we say to be true that allow us to come to free speech? And it is my contention that there are three. First, the individual. We have this belief that the individual exists as a metaphysical entity on their own, and that's not just a human invention. Secondly, that there is truth that transcends the individual, truth that's broader than us, truth that exists in an absolute sense. And finally, that language can be a means toward that truth. And we're going to take a day speaking about each. So today what I want to do is I want to explore the biblical foundations of free speech by looking at the biblical foundations of the individual. But before we get into this, I want to lay out a couple warnings that we should look out for as we go about this discussion. The first is told by C.S. Lewis. So who is C.S. Lewis? He's one of the great Christian thinkers of the 20th century. He had a conversion at about age 50 as a professor from Cambridge, and what he came to the conclusion was, it's rare in the Christian literature, but he said he looked at the facts, came to the rational belief that Christ did rise from the dead, and it changed his life. He's most well known for his works Narnia, the fictional narrative, but his philosophical and more theological writings nonetheless have great merit. And one thing C.S. Lewis says in a book called The Screwtape Letters, and The Screwtape Letters is a wonderful book. It's beyond thought-provoking, it's action-provoking. And what he does is, it's a series of letters between Wormwood, who's a senior official in hell, and his nephew, who's a younger demon in the ranks. And they're talking about, how do you catch a human soul, right? And one of the things he tells him is, make him to believe a historical narrative of Jesus that's outside the bounds of the Bible. And I don't want to fall into that because we're treading a very close line here, because what I'm essentially saying is that the words of Christ establish the bounds for liberalism. But Christ is not a liberal thinker. He's not as simple as the human theory and boxes that we put him in. He's something more than that. The second point is, we're going to be skipping over some nuance, right? We're covering a lot of philosophical ground here today. But I want to make something clear. The West doesn't have a hegemony over Christianity, and free speech is not uniquely Christian, right? So obviously the way we got free speech, it's a combination of Hellenistic thought. There's other ideas that are packed in there, and even secular ideas. And when you look at Christianity, there's more ways to go about looking through this than the Western lens, right? And I'm not denying that for a second. But nonetheless, when the West structured their ethic, even in the United States, in our Declaration of Independence, when Thomas Jefferson says we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, it was more a brand of deism, but we can put that aside for the time being. But my point here is that it's not as simple as what we're looking at, but we can get a general idea. And the third thing, and then we can get started, is we have to, it's more unique to today, but C.S. Lewis, once again, in one of his books, Mere Christianity, has a chapter where he talks about how Christianity is not individualist or collectivist, right? In the land of political doctrines, and I completely agree with that. It's something deeper. We're not looking at individualism as a political idea. We're looking at it as a philosophical premise, which moves me into my next part. What do I mean by individualism, right? Because for about a year and a half now, I've been thinking through this idea and thinking through, what does it mean to be an individual? I saw the founders relied on this idea heavily. You know, Jordan Peterson's kind of popularized it in a new light. So maybe if you're looking at individualism, you come across, let's start with Jordan Peterson's brand. The existentialism that we live in a universe where meaning is not around. and essentially what your job is to do and go and manufacture meaning for yourself. But I'm not sure if we're strong enough to do that. Or you could look at Ayn Rand's brand of individualism, the rugged individual, which is pretty much an economic premise, where she lays out that the individual is the only sphere for morality, and that in economic terms, they're the building block, which I think has its merit, but that's not what we're going to speak about either. Or, today we see the prevalence of New Age philosophies that say that the individual is the expression of divinity. The individual is divine in and of themselves, but you're not a God. You're a human, and God can work through you, but you're not a God in and of yourself. And then finally, I think it's important that we note that when I'm talking about the individual, I'm not saying an individual that exists in free-floating manner apart from the collective group and blows by the collective needs. Not at all. I'm just saying you exist on your own in a sense, but you still have to look out for the collective needs. And I think I started to, in a sense, give up. I didn't know where I could find a thinker who encompassed this idea. And then I came across a book by a philosopher who just recently passed away, Sir Roger Scruton. And it's a book on human nature. And I think he addresses this problem better than I ever could. And I want to read his verbiage and his definition. So he refers to his brand of individualism as deep individuality. And I'm going to explain why I think that's the best metric by which we look at this problem. This is from his book on human nature. But in all cases, we must distinguish individualism, the emphasis on individuals as the creators of their life and its value, from deep individuality, a metaphysical condition that, as persons, we share whether or not we are also individualists. Desmond's individuality is, and for context, he's a good British man and he has a horse named Desmond, so he's juxtaposing his soul with the soul of his horse, Desmond. And he says, Desmond's individuality is, compared with mine, a shallow thing. I am not merely an individual animal in the way that Desmond is. I identify myself as an individual across time. I take responsibility for my past and make promises for the future. I lay claim to the world as a sphere of my own agency, and my doing this is an expression of the deep individuality that is part of the human condition, which is the condition of a creature that can say I. So this eventually formulates into a political doctrine, but on its own, it's a metaphysical presupposition. And what I mean by that is when you're trying to interpret the world and the universe around you, aside from the jargon, what that's saying is you can look at the world as a conglomeration of groups. And you can look at people as nothing more than the sum total of their familiar bounds or the environment they're in. Or you could take it as this route of deep individuality and say behind the pillars of group identity that exist in people, there's something almost transcendent about them. And that's the definition that we're going to be working with today. But I think it's important to note that this conception is far from the norm, right? Clifford Geertz is an anthropologist, and we'll go ahead and read what he had to say on this. But what Geertz is looking is at a comparative analysis of how different cultures represent the self, represent the individual. And he notes the West's uniqueness. He said the Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, more or less integrated, motivational, and cognitive universe, a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action, organized into a distinctive whole and set, contrastively both against other such wholes and against its social and natural background, is however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's culture. What's he getting at here? He's saying, we've stumbled upon something unique here, and I want to focus on his last line. However incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's cultures. Part of what I want to explore over the next 3 days is we're taking these ideas for granted that the West has come up with. And unless we can rekindle the flame that brought us here, we're going to be running the risk of doing away with it. So let's now get into it. Where did this idea come from? And I think this journey begins with the political philosopher by the name of Larry Seidentop, who wrote a book called Inventing the Individual. And he tracks the historical lineage of the idea. And he says, when you look at antiquity, there's a very fundamental difference from today. They don't make the distinctions about being that we do. So the modern man can easily separate nature from culture. Perhaps the fundamental psychological question is this the human spirit a cultural creation or a natural creation? That wasn't even on the man of antiquity's horizon. In fact, there was no differentiation made between what is culture and what is nature. Now, the reason this is important is when they looked out at nature, what did they see? natural order. There was a rigid hierarchy to things. So in their minds, that went into the cultural sphere as well. So you think about it, the ancient family, you had the pater familias, who was at the top. It was a rigidly hierarchical society in every way, in every respect. Right? Even religion, for instance. Religion, it was a tribal god, and it was the family that was sacred. It was the family that was the religious entity. And then you can look at a function like reason. We'll come back to this in a little bit. But reason, to the man of antiquity, only belonged to those at the top. And that's why we'll talk about Plato's attack on democracy more tomorrow. But one thing Plato says is, he lays out this attack on democracy through Socrates. And he says, picture a ship, right? And there's this old kind of owner, he's a little senile, and he's looking to give his ship to a new captain. And there's all these men, and they're all these kind of mediocre dudes. But then there's the captain. But the problem is the captain doesn't end up being the captain of the ship. And the reason this attack made sense to Plato and to the men of antiquity is because the captain and the layman, there was a huge difference because there's a natural order to things. There's a natural hierarchy that exists. Today we assume everyone to be equal, which is a good assumption, and we're going to talk about how it becomes developed. But it wasn't where we came from. So where did things start to change? Well, I think Ravi Zacharias is the first to kind of lay this out, stumble upon this. And he's a contemporary Christian thinker. And what Ravi points out is there's this unique element of the message of Christ. And when you look at religious thinkers prior and even after, they're not claiming to be the divine representation that comes and lives with you. Instead, they say, so here I am, and here's a set of sacred texts that you can abide by. Muhammad is pointing to the Quran. You look at someone like even Buddha. Buddha's pointing to the noble truths to guide you in this life. Jesus makes a different claim. Jesus says, I stand at the door of every heart and knock. And if anyone hears my voice, I will come in. Just to use one verse as an example. What he's saying is, I can go directly to you, the individual. And this is a very new claim. And we actually can tell how new and how raw of a claim it was to the assumptions of the old world because Jesus said it and no one knew what he meant. He came into Jerusalem and he's looking at the temple that they had built. And he said, I will tear down this temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And everyone's lost. They said, what do you mean? How are you building down the temple? Or taking down this temple? This man must be crazy. But what they didn't understand is he was talking about your body as a temple. Later in Paul's letters, he says, what know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost? You see, this new idea begins to become developed, and it's like maybe God can have a relationship with you outside of where you exist in the natural order of things. Maybe from the king all the way down to the slave, there's something that we can reduce them to that Christ can hit on. And that's what began to happen. You see, he started to bypass social roles, and it started with the family. The family was the sacred tribe, and the gods, when you track ancient history, the gods of the past were familial gods. It was your ancestors. You're praying to your ancestors, right? It's not you as an individual who's there worshiping. It's a familial entity. And what this essentially did was, you can look at something like the Old Testament, right? In the Old Testament, it's just tracking the familial lineage into the Messiah. And what Christ did is something that none of the Old Testament thinkers expected. He took this belief, this rigid belief, and universalized it. He said, not only is this for the Jews, this is for the Gentiles. And they're thinking, what? What do you mean? Religion is a group activity. It's a social phenomenon. And Christ said, wait a minute. You might be a Jew and you might be a Samaritan, but fundamentally you're all the same. And it's on that fundamental level of analysis that we're going to talk to. So what exists on that deeper realm, right? Because that's not a self-evident claim. And I think Jesus starts to answer that question when he had the Pharisees and the Sadducees come. And these were the religious Jews of the time. And they're trying to trick Jesus into saying something that can get him killed. And one thing to note about Jesus that we'll talk about with day 3 is he's careful with his words, right? And they come up to him and they say, Jesus, and you look at the time in Rome, it's mass political upheaval, and they're looking for him to be a revolutionary, or at least say he will be so they can get him killed. And they say, Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And he says, whose name is on that coin? Or whose face is on the coin? And they look, and it's Caesar. And they say, Christ, it's Caesar. And he says, okay, we'll give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. What does that mean? What he's saying is, yes, there's the temporal world. There's the world of the natural order. There's the world of the rigid hierarchy. But then there's a different part of reality that you haven't even tapped into yet. There's an salvation manifests before eternity, meaning that while you're in this world right now, he established this domain of conscience where no man, no state, no government can touch. He delivered the greatest check on tyranny that any political thinker can ever do. He said, look, there's this realm of conscience where you believe to be right and wrong that no man, no temporal power is able to touch. He divided up reality. And this led Jean-Jacques Rousseau to believe that Jesus is actually the first Enlightenment thinker. You know, we think of our modern conception of church and state. Where do you think that came from? It came from Christ dividing the institutions and saying these are separate. And remember how else that is big, because what do we talk about with antiquity? None of those distinctions were made. It was all amassed together, but he was able to divide it up. So what happens when Christ lays out this new domain of conscience? It changed civil associations. So before, once again, let's return to the assumptions of antiquity. It was natural order. It was filled with people who were better off and worse off than you. And a quick nuance on this, it's not to say that when Christ came down and said all these things, instantly it all changed. We're still yet to see the completion and where a lot of these ideas will go. But Christ dropped these seeds, right? And part of what started to shift was the civil associations. And this is what Larry Seidentop points out, that instead of being predicated upon hierarchy and reason and some men being above others, it was reduced men to their domain of conscience. And what that required was a redefining of morality. Because what Malcolm Muggeridge points out is Jesus took ethics as a social entity and made it personal. And Malcolm Muggeridge, he's one of the great journalists of the 20th century. He's the one back when the Soviet Union was throwing people in gulags. A lot of the West intelligentsia denied it. Thought it was fine. They'd take trips over there and the communists would show them, the good part of it. But Malcolm Muggeridge said, well, wait a minute. Something's not all as it seems. But he's pointing out that ethics were a social thing, a tribal thing, a familial thing, a thing associated with hierarchy. Jesus shifted that. And so how do we come to redefine morality? And I think the best definition for that comes from F.A. Hayek. And F.A. Hayek is one of the great 20th century economic thinkers. He comes from the school of thought known as austerity, which, if you can divide 20th century economic thought to two schools, it was the Keynesian view that maybe if we stimulate the economy from the bottom up, it'll work. And then there's the austerity view, which is if you allow businesses, in a sense, to take care of their people and lessen regulations, they will innovate. And so he's an economic thinker, but he lays out this definition of morality that's absolutely brilliant in terms of what we're talking about. We're going to figure out why that is. So this is from his work, The Road to Serfdom. He says, what our generation is in danger of forgetting is not only that morals are of necessity a phenomena of individual conduct, but also that they can exist only in the sphere in which the individual is free to decide for himself and is called upon voluntarily to sacrifice personal advantage to the observance of a moral rule. Outside the sphere of individual responsibility, there's neither goodness nor badness. Responsibility not to a superior, but to one's conscience. The awareness of a duty not exacted by compulsion. The necessity to decide which of the things one values are to be sacrificed to others, and to bear the consequences of one's decision, are the very essence of any morals which deserve the name. He's saying, to be a moral question, it has to exist within the bounds of the individual conscience. Freedom is the prerequisite to morality. You're not making a moral choice if you're forced into it. Morality comes into play where there's this axis between good and evil, and your conscience is mediating it, and it's all about how are you going to act. Jesus said, I don't care about the temporal rules you fill. I don't care about what the social whims are. I'm asking, where's your heart? Right? What are you going to do? And you can think about this definition of morality in the backdrop of the story of creation. So, what happened when Christ made humans? He made them free. He gave them free will, and he sets them in the utopia, in the Garden of Eden. And he says, You can live as you like, but I have one rule for you. Don't bite from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And what do? They bit from it. So they took his free will and they turned it against him, and then we descended into history. And that's where we are now. We're living in the repercussions of that original sin. And in the same way, what Larry Seidentop points out is this new understanding of morality. Seidentop doesn't look to Hayek's definition, but he would approve of it because Hayek's getting to the idea that individual responsibility is the sphere where morality exists. This was turned against the church. So in the Enlightenment thinker said, wait a minute, don't you believe that the conscience is the bound by which moral questions are to be asked? And they said, well, yes. And they said, okay, we don't believe in God. We're going to do with it on our own. And the church was kind of in this catch-22. Right? And obviously that wasn't a clear, articulate decision, that was argument that was being had, but it was the subscript, right? And part of the reason that the Spanish Enlightenment was delayed was because of the dogma of the church, because they realized that this idea, if true, is universal. If it's true that individual responsibility is the sphere for morality, then that applies to everyone, even if they don't believe in Christ. And what this did is it universalized morality, right? So it was once at one point thought that, and we'll get into this later, that slaves didn't have souls, right? Aristotle says some men are fit to be slaves. And a historian by the name of Guy Boyce wrote a book called The Year of the Transformation 1000, and what he points out is, look, slavery is a human universal, and it takes hundreds and hundreds of years to get rid of the institution of slavery. But what started that dialogue? It was Christ saying, by the way, it's not just you who has a soul. It's not just the Jew. It's not just the man at the top, right? It's universal who has a soul and who can be in communication with God. And there's even this story of how when Jesus was on the cross, there was a veil that was torn. And to put that into context, so in that, going back to the story of the temple, within the temple there was this building, and only the high priest could enter it, and only once a year. And there was this 30 feet long veil that went up in the air. And the idea there is it's the rigid hierarchy. Once again, only those at the top can go in and experience God. When Jesus died, that veil was torn. And there's a famous line from a Roman soldier that says, surely this man is the Son of God. But what the claim there is no longer is it only those at the top who experience it, it's everyone. And this transpired into the mythological legends that we got. And I think it's important to know the function of myths. So we're going to take a little detour just to explain Jungian psychology. So Carl Jung is someone who's in intelligentsia just been pushed away, because when you read about his writings on alchemy and some more obscure topics, it's too esoteric for me or most people to understand. But what Jung understood was the function that religion and myth plays. He was a psychoanalytic psychologist, and he split from Sigmund Freud because Sigmund Freud was so quick to dismiss with religion. But Carl Jung said, well, wait a minute. Maybe there's more to religion than just fear of death. And what he points out is that myths compile the rules from a culture into one person and tell you how to act, right? So you can think about it as, what's the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, right? There's rules in there that we're not really sure what to do with, but what it tells you is that the individual at the top of your culture is the one who tells the truth, right? It's the honest individual in a sense. What was the mythological narrative before Christ? And obviously there's more nuance here, and there were more myths that have universal elements before Jesus, but it's something like Odysseus, right? In the Odyssey and the Iliad. And Odysseus is this aristocratic man who comes from a good family, who is someone who has fame and notoriety in the community. He's well liked, he's well respected. And it's this very hierarchical view of what constitutes the good citizen. Well, that started to shift with Christ. It became the individual who was hated by the state. The Romans called the Christian martyrs enemies of the human race. But that was the myth, that was the legend that was spread. It was these Christians who were willing to die radically for their faith and be hated for it. Brothers turned against brothers, sisters against sisters. And we have this idea that Christ came to give us all peace. No. What Jesus said is, I came to turn families against each other. I came to give truth, right? The truth is going to pit you against men. And just like the world doesn't recognize me, they will not recognize you. So, but the myth is they come to believe Christ and they follow the belief out even to their death. And it's the people at the bottom of society all the way to the top. It's a more universal picture of what it means to be a good citizen. And what did this start to do? This started to develop into equality. Because what Christ pointed out is your social position is secondary to your relationship with Christ. Right? And there was a debate I was watching between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. Sam Harris goes, all the Bible had to do was condemn slavery. And maybe the modern man would be okay with it. He doesn't say that verbatim, but that's the idea. And, we already talked about slavery a little bit and how it actually came to end through Christian thought. But what Mr. Harris doesn't quite understand is that the role of the Bible is not concerned with the temporal domain of reality. It's not concerned with what you give to Caesar. It's concerned with what you give to God. And when we start to understand that in this domain of conscience, we're all slaves in a sense. That's what Christ is saying, and he came to free each and every one of us. And we're not justifying slavery in the slightest. It's the sin of this nation. It was a universal sin of humanity. But nonetheless, the point that's beginning to unfold is that below what you see, below what meets the eye, there's this deep individuality that exists in each and every one of us. And that's what Christ is looking at. That's what Christ is aiming at. And it is on that realm that we are able to be free, that we are able to be established as equals. So, I want to read another story from the Bible. And this is from John 4. And this is the story of Jesus coming to a well. And we're going to go ahead and read it and look at it and see what it means for us. So John says, "Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, 'Will you give me a drink?' His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, 'You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?' For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." Jesus answered, "If you knew the gift of God and who it was that asked you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is too deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Anyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I can get thirsty, so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go call your husband and come back." And she said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you're now with is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus said, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth." So what do we learn from that story? Right? Here's what I want to go through and look at. First, Jesus comes to this well, and there's the Samaritan lady sitting there. And on 3 accounts, we can see the assumptions of collective group identity and equality coming into play. First, it's Samaritan, and the author points out that the Jews hated the Samaritans. So there's already that group identity clashed. Secondly, she's a woman. And in that time, right, it was a society stratified by gender. And finally, we learn that ethically, she's committing adultery of sorts. So on 3 accounts, Jesus should have done away with her, right? But Jesus is telling her that beyond all of this, beyond all of your sin, there's eternal water that you're craving. And she doesn't understand the message the whole time. She's saying, what do you mean? She's saying, I have eternal water for you. And he says, all right, let me get my bucket. We can fill it up. And he's saying, no. It's beyond that. And even she starts to say that the Jews took the geographical place where we're supposed to worship. And Jesus said, he's essentially saying, when my time comes to be, after I die and resurrect, it's no longer going to matter the geographical epicenter where you come and see God. Why? Because the new conduit is inside of you. That's how we see God. That's how you reach God. And she doesn't understand this message at all, and she's trying to work through it. But what Jesus is saying is basically beyond your social identity, beyond your social roles, there's a deeper layer of conscience that we're hitting at. And just like with the question with the coin, what did Jesus do? He divided reality into two segments. He said there's the temporal and there's the eternal. He did that with the soul right there. He said that your psychological makeup is divided up between your craving for the eternal. He says, I will give you water that you'll never be thirsty again. And then the temporal, which is, well, we need to drink water. And this is an important tenet of Christianity, and I think Fyodor Dostoevsky understood that best. He is this 19th century Russian novelist, and what people say his best novel is The Brothers Kamarov. And in this novel, he tells a story, and it's known as the Grand Inquisitor. And he uses his character, Ivan Kamarov, who's this brilliant atheist, to tell it. And Ivan writes the story, and he says, okay, picture Jesus comes down during the Spanish Inquisition, and he starts healing people. And what happens is the Catholic Church catches wind of this, and they take him and they lock him up. And they basically say, Jesus, we're going to kill you tomorrow. And the Grand Inquisitor walks in and starts talking to Jesus, and Jesus is silent the whole time. It's supposed to echo when he was silent with Pontius Pilate, when he was continually questioning him. And what the case that the Grand Inquisitor makes against Jesus, he says, Jesus, you did it wrong. When Jesus walked about in the desert for 40 days, Satan came and tempted him. And Satan said, you see that rock? You're the Son of God. You can turn that into bread. And what did Jesus say? He says, man does not live on bread alone. There's more to you than your material makeup. And he says, that's where you went wrong. What has the church done? The church has fed people. The church has taken that impulse to be taken care of and effectively enslaved people by doing so. But he's saying, you shouldn't have made man free. And you shouldn't have made man, you should have just filled all their material requirements. You should have essentially walked out the prosperity gospel. And this is what makes the Grand Inquisitor is known as literature's first tyrant. Why is he a tyrant? It's because he's making the same assumption and mistake that every tyrant makes. They say their mistake is twofold. It's psychological and it's metaphysical. The psychological element is they say humanity is a blank slate. I can do with it what I may. I can reconstruct the domain that we exist in through political means, right? I can politically manipulate humanity. If you read Marx, right? Marx says it's going to take a new man in the future to come into being. In the French Revolution, they basically thought they could reshape human history, but it's also deeper. They think that the fundamental layer of reality is, in a sense, political. But most of our problems are not going to be solved through political means. And I think that, in our generation today, we see a lot of these student activist types, right, which has its merit. But one thing Patrick Henry said was, the survival of liberty necessitates people not really caring about government. And he goes on to quote the Bible, and he says, instead, focus on what is true, what is right, what is good, what is noble. What is he saying? There's two domains. There's the political, and then there's the metaphysical. Focus on the latter, because that's what matters, right? And we've basically gotten into this idea where we're telling people that they're just a material creation. And obviously, you look at the mental health crisis today, and you could say there's many things that brought us here. Yes. Is technology playing a role? Yes. Could our economic structures be playing a role? Yes. Are there more confounding variables that we can't even identify? Yes. But I don't think we're at the place yet in our culture where we can count out the fact that maybe part of the reason we're seeing this mental health crisis is because we're telling people that they're just a material construction. What is he telling the lady at the well? He's saying, there's eternal water that won't make you thirsty again. And what are we telling people? We're saying, here, take more water, right? Take more of this earthly temporal water, this hedonistic pleasure, right? The man of today is living better off than any man throughout history. We're not having to toil, we have downtime. The amount of hours you have to work has gone down, the amount of money you're making is going up, comparatively in history. 250,000 people every day are being brought out of extreme poverty. But what is happening in the richest nations of the world? People are miserable. Why is that? Maybe material comfort doesn't necessarily guarantee your happiness in a sense. And that's what Dostoevsky's claim is, not just through the Grand Inquisitor, but in Notes from Underground. He's living in a time when Marxist ideas and utopian ideas are coming around, when people are saying, we can make the utopia here on earth. Why? Because if perfection can't come in a heavenly kingdom, then humanity has to bring it here on earth. And what Dostoevsky says is, you don't understand humans one bit. He says that material comfort will not satisfy that craving. What you're craving for is deeper water. And there's this movie that my girlfriend made me watch. It was called, oh, she's gonna kill me. It's a movie with Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper. And they write the song drunk in a driveway at like 2 a.m. And the song's called Shallow. And the opening verse is, tell me, just kidding. It's tell me something, girl. Are you happy in this modern world? Or is there something more? Is there something else you're searching for? And it's called Shallow, and the idea is we're living in this shallow hole of modernity where we've augmented people from craving for that eternal water. We're telling them, don't take this, be rational, don't go down this walk of faith. And it's our greatest mistake, honestly, that we're making right now. So then what we can do is we can look at, I want to move into the next part of this, right? And we're going to go ahead and review and move on to the next part. So, what have we discovered? There are these assumptions of antiquity, of natural order, of rigid hierarchies. Jesus comes and says, I deal on the level of the individual. What did that do? That redefined social relations by putting everyone on the equal plane of conscience. That redefined morality and put it inside of you. And that redefined equality, right? And it gave equality to all people. And then we learned from these presuppositions of working with the individual, reality gets divided up into two parts, eternal and temporal. Not only is that metaphysical, but it's also something that exists inside of you. So then we can ask the question, okay, Christ did all this. Can secular modes of thought get us to these ends? And this is another example of a question that I'm thinking through still, and really just starting to, and I'm not providing an answer. I'm going to dance around it, but it's something that we're going to have to ask, and we are asking collectively. And I think someone, once again, who I didn't expect him to use so much in this talk, but Dostoevsky. What did he do in his work, Crime and Punishment? He basically paints this character of Raskolnikov. And Raskolnikov is a modern man, right? He's a man of his generation, a good progressive man. And he's embodying the ideas of his time, which is a combination of German nihilism, French humanism, and English utilitarianism. And what Raskolnikov does is he basically does away with the idea of God. He does away with the idea of metaphysical limits, of having to be afraid of God. So he says, okay, we can make morality for ourselves. What does he do? He goes and he commits a double homicide. But his theory is what's interesting. You see, he devises this theory that there are great men, and there are men who are just deserved to be, you can do away with them in a sense. And he says that this woman, he didn't mean to kill the second one, but he ends up killing her. But these two women, to him, are just women at the bottom. And and I don't know if Dostoevsky meant to go this far, but what's he saying here? The assumption of equality that Christ gave us is unique. And if we do away with it, there's nothing that makes us equal anymore. I mean, we can go ahead and say we're equal, but when the going gets tough, what's to really keep that more violent and sinister elements of our nature from coming into manifestation? And you might think you have too bad a view of the human psyche, but how do you explain the 20th century? I mean, we could say we're equal all we want. One thing Justice Scalia pointed out was that the Soviet Union had a better Bill of Rights than the United States. which is a fascinating claim, but it had no legitimacy. Why? Because it wasn't grounded in a deeper constitution. In the same manner, we can say that we're equal on consequentialist terms. Or I hear that we're seeing the rise of humanism, right? Secular humanism. That we're all humans, we're all equal. But what's to stop you from shifting that? Because what Raskolnikov figured out is he was poor, he was delirious, he was hungry. And he runs the cost-benefit analysis and he says, I don't have a choice, I have to kill these ladies, because no longer does he assume them to be equal. He goes back to the assumptions of antiquity, but on a hierarchical distribution, and he sees them not as an individual, right? He does away with the idea of the individual and says, they're atoms, right? They're just their material structure. And I think one thing that Soren Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky are writing in somewhat of the same existentialist tradition, but they gave a Christian spin to it. And one thing Kierkegaard said is the best representation of equality is in loving your neighbor as yourself. When Christ said to love your neighbor, that was equality, right? And if you look at the story that Christ used to teach that, it goes back to, remember we talked about how Samaritan and Jews hated each other. So this Jewish man was robbed, beat to a pulp, and left on the side of a road. And first the religious thinkers walk by, and they look at him and they do away with him. And then another group of people walk by, and it's all the people who the society held up as the great men. And they all walk by. And finally a Samaritan walks by. And a Samaritan they hated. It was somewhat, it was the racial group, it was the out group, the people they did away with. And the Samaritan walks by and he sees him and he helps him. And the idea is beyond the bounds of group identity, when you reduce people to the level of conscience, that's equality. And you look at your neighbor as yourself. Why? Because you treat yourself as if you have this deep individuality. Just take track of your thoughts for a moment. You know, you treat yourself as if there's something more to you than just your skin and atoms. And I think what Jesus is getting at is no matter the group or the social position of other individuals, they have that too. And, you know, even when I was in middle school, I went to this classical school. And we studied what were called fallacies. And it's a Hellenistic idea. It kind of came out of Greco-Roman thought. But what are fallacies? Fallacies are logical flaws. And it essentially means that you can make an argument, but if you use these terms, the argument doesn't really count. And the most famous fallacy is an ad hominem. It means to the man. And what you're saying is, so let's say we're having an argument. So let's say, you know, I have my friend Colin here, and he, after each of these lectures, he does a great job of pushing back on me. And he tells me, you're wrong about this. You didn't get this right. And if Colin looked at me and he said, yeah, well, you're fat. You know, well, that might be true. But you're not contending with the argument. Because outside the bounds of who I am and my social position, there's something transcendent about my deep individuality. There's something transcendent about what I'm getting at. And this tinkers into what we'll talk about with language. But what is the postmodern claim of today? They're going back to the ideas of antiquity. They're saying, Derrida brings up this term of deconstruction. And you deconstruct the text, but we've also deconstructed the individual. What does that mean? No longer are you this conscious agent. We've bought into this lie of intersectionality, that you're just the sum total of your identities. And the original definition of an intersectionality was coined in 1989 by this feminist scholar. It's technically true, and it's like, okay, identities don't add, they interact. What that means is if you're a black, gay, lesbian woman, it's not exactly being black plus being lesbian. They interact together, right there. And it's showing the bonds of group identity in a sense. I didn't do too well explaining that, but that's not an important piece for right now. But what intersectionality today is essentially saying is that you're not an individual. You're the sum total of all your different group identities. What's the claim? Oh, well, you're a white male. It's like, fair enough, but I'm also an individual, right? And it's the same game that can be played. You look back in the 1960s, or like, you know, pre-Civil War, it's like, oh, you don't have rights, you can't vote, you're a black man. It's like, well, you know, fair enough, but I'm also a conscious agent, right? So maybe you should contend with that a little more. And so my point, I guess, when we can review this is that what Christ laid out is the foundations for the individual. It's the foundations for equality. And it's my thesis that's going to run throughout this, that we can't ground that in secular thought. So now I want to move into my last section of this. And we're going to look at, so we've established the individual metaphysically, but we're going to establish the individual socially. How does the individual interact in relation to others? And to do that, I'm actually going to look at, so something Jonathan Haidt points out in his book, The Righteous Mind from 2012, and he says, he calls forth a scientist by the name of Paul Rosen from 1974 who wrote a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma. And what the Omnivore's Dilemma is humans are omnivores, which gives us great benefits. And what that means is we can go into new lands and eat just about any food there. But the problem is, since we can eat more food than other animals, we're also prone to eating infectious foods and harmful diseases and becoming infected. So it's this dilemma. So your psyche is split between two parts of you in a sense. And it's the part of you that's neophobic, which is afraid of new experiences. Because it's saying, hey man, that bush might be dangerous, but it transcends into all areas of life. It's like, don't go to that party. There's unknown there that could be dangerous. But then there's the part of you that's neophilic. And neophilic means it loves new experiences. It says, hey, look, the last 2 weeks you've sat inside and done the same thing. Maybe it's time to go out and venture into a new domain of life. And these parts are in a constant dialogue between each other, right? It goes down into our internal psyche. And what Bertrand Russell points out, and Haidt draws this line, in his book, A History of Western Philosophy, going back to 600 BC to the present, there's two schools of thought that always remain constant. And it's the one that says, hey, maybe we should rely on what we know to be true. That's the conservative tradition, right? And then there's a side that says, hey, we're in a new time period, time to wake up and update our morality. And that's the progressive wisdom. And the thing is, both sides are true, right? Because if you're all the way progressive, you have nothing to stand upon. But if you're all the way conservative, you're not able to exist in time anymore. And the individual is what straddles that line. Now you might be bent toward one way or the other, but the individual walks that line between known experience and what is new. The individual walks the line between conservative and liberal. And I want to explain why that matters by using a Hungarian psychologist by the name of Mikolaj Csikszentmihalyi. Took a couple YouTube videos to get that name right. And what he points out, he writes this book on creativity. And he says that we have this idea of creative people, that the creative individual is the one who does away with the dogmas of the time, who basically comes onto the scene and says, all the collective wisdom of the past is wrong. Let me go ahead and chart my own course. And what he says is, The creative individual is the one who masters the wisdom of the past in their field and then goes on into making new heights. And you can think about it like in philosophy, right? Each new philosopher was an expert in all the philosophers before them, and then they can add to it. Right? If you're a great basketball player, you master all the moves prior, and then you go out and you make your own. Now let's bring it home to Jesus. What did Jesus do? Jesus didn't just come and kick the Old Testament law out of the way. Jesus came to the law and he said, he updated it. He said, he's an expert in the old law. All throughout the Gospels, it's remarked at how they're so blown away with how brilliant Jesus is. He knows and he understands the law. But in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you've heard this about the law, but I tell you this. I raise it to a new standard. Jesus is the archetype of the creative individual. And my point is, that's for each of us. Each of us walk this out in a social sphere. And what that means is this is the point that we can abstract out of all of these different points, coming back to the omnivore's dilemma. Is you exist in terms of the group, right? The group is the known experience. But you also exist as an individual. And you straddle the line between the two. If you're too wrapped in group identity, we fall into the dangers that Orwell told us about. The collectivism that leads to tyranny. If you fall too far into John Stuart Mill's individualism, and each of us is our own free-floating individual, you fall into the trap that Emil Durkheim talks about in his book on suicide. That when there's nothing that binds people together, he's trying to make a social explanation for suicide. He said when groups aren't integrated enough, that's the verbiage he uses, then the individuals just go off and live in normlessness. And there's nothing to bound them. So my point in getting in this last section is walk the line in between that. And we're going to bring this into how that contributes to free speech on the third day. So let's review. Antiquity was the assumption of natural inequality of a collective group. Then we came and got the idea of the individual from Christ separating reality and separating your psyche. But the individual is only grounded, it grounds equality. And that can only make sense within a Judeo-Christian framework. From there, we're able to look at, okay, but how, that tells us metaphysically how the individual exists, but in a social term, how do we exist in terms of others? And the answer is, you're not too wrapped into your group identity, but you are a social critter. So you also go out and you make new experiences, you chart new courses. So I want to thank you guys for being with me today. That'll probably be the longest lecture that we do. Tomorrow we're going to pick up with truth, and then we're going to finish up with language. So I hope to see you all here. Thank you for tuning in.